members accountable without micromanaging. Now, if you are a woman in leadership and you are struggling with this, I'm going to dig into today into 3 common mistakes that I see, as well as 3 strategies of how you can fix this. Then this is a great live or great video training for you to watch today. So it might sound familiar for you if you are finding yourself about to you're coming up to the end of the year, and of course those sales targets may not have been met, or some other KPI hasn't yet been achieved that you want to and you desire to need to achieve by the end of this year, and you're struggling to have that conversation or how to approach your team members and keep them accountable without actually having to step in and do it for them, or really micromanaging to a level where you're checking in every single day to make sure that they're taking the actions and getting the results that they need to achieve. So that's what we're going to cover today. I'm excited to share it with you. If you're jumping on there for the first time, hi, I'm Kim. I am an executive, a coach, an advisor, as well as a leadership strategist for women in senior leadership positions. And I come on here every Tuesday and Friday and share different trainings and information all around the topics of women and leadership, as well as empowering women to thrive in their careers, because there's nothing I love to see more than women who are passionate and thriving in the careers that they have, and seeing the number of women that we have in leadership positions increase throughout our society and our organizations, because the more women that we have that climb the ladder or achieve those lovely positions and break through the glass ceiling, it is the better for the innovations, better for the problem solving, as well as just better for our society in general. So there's a little bit of behind the scenes into what drives me as well. So let's dive into this today, because what we're talking about today is about how to keep your team members accountable. Now, this is a conversation that I've been having quite a bit in the last couple of weeks with clients, because they found themselves really struggling in terms of, how do I have this conversation, yet I don't want to really step in and do the work for them or take the responsibility away, and something needs to change. Things aren't working. So how do I have this conversation with them? So when we start this conversation, often at times there's a couple of common mistakes that I see that are occurring. So if you might have experienced that as well. I know I did at the very beginning. Is I wanted to, be very attentive in keeping my team accountable and getting the results. Yet I also didn't want to be that type of manager who micromanages and is really in their face all the time about what they're doing and how they're accomplishing it, because I didn't like that either. Now, here's the thing. When you're finding yourself in this situation, you likely are going to find yourself either going back down that micromanaging route or completely letting go. And we need to find a really great balance in between. And what common mistakes that I've seen is, number one, is that there's a lack of clarity around what needs to be done and what actually the accountability is. So, for example, one of those could be that you have asked for a specific report to be completed by Friday. Now, your team member completes a report by Friday, and we think, great, they're all done. Whereas when you receive the report, it's like, well, but I'm missing a section on the risk analysis. Maybe I'm missing, well, it needed to have 3 different business options, and it needed to have a business decision in here. There's an analysis that's missing. You get the point, right? So whereas the employee handed in a report, your team member handed in a report that they believe has completed the action and the requests as you've given it, when you receive it, the outcome isn't what you had expected or wanted. And that starts with, on the front end, not having created the clarity that you need around what the outcomes are that you desire to achieve. Now, a second common mistake that I often see is in this desire not to be a micromanager. And oftentimes we know it about ourselves, and you might know this yourself as well, whether or not you have the tendency to really micromanage or you have the tendency to be really laid back. But at times, if you're also really aware of, like, I don't really want, you're not aware where that line is between when am I still being effective and checking in and holding them accountable versus when am I micromanaging, you might find yourself have given your team members, or a team member specifically, a lot of freedom to begin with the expectation that they understand what they're doing. They have the responsibilities, and that you have an expectation of a certain amount of expertise, experience, and knowledge of that individual that would make them successful in the role and carrying out the responsibilities and achieving the outcomes and results that you need them to achieve in their position. And then what you find is, for example, maybe they're avoiding specific actions. So I've had conversations around, well, we need to make more sales this month. Are you calling and speaking to different clients? And you could even get more specific. How many clients and which type of clients have you been calling? And you find that they're not taking those actions. Or maybe they need to be more collaborative within the organization, having actual conversations, meeting with people, speaking to people, and they're not doing those actions. Well, that's, in a sense, you're finding that you might think, well, I don't want to step in and really have to do all of it for them. Yet I've stepped back so far that they're also not taking those actions that they're needed to be doing. So you've given them a lot of freedom, trusting that they are going to be able, they have the experience, the knowledge, and the expertise to get the job done. And then the results are speaking for themselves in this case, that they don't have that knowledge and expertise, and they're not getting things done. And the third common mistake that I see is avoiding those tough conversations. So you aren't getting the results you want. You don't really want to micromanage them. And yet the other side of this is you also don't want to come across as like a very dominant or maybe heavy-handed or maybe the bossy person or the bad guy in your organization and your team. So you avoid having really tough conversations. What I've seen some women do in their leadership positions is they're very prepared. They know they go into the conversation, and then the conversation, what they find is like, well, the first sign of pushback, they actually back off, like, okay, well, maybe I might have seen that wrong, so let's reevaluate. And you've backed down, or you find yourself also over explaining yourself. So you might get from your team member a lot of questions, and or you so that you're answering those questions and explaining, or you might not, it's not even explaining on basis of questions, but you are explaining is actually a way of you defending what you're doing or what you're asking them, or how you're explaining your perspective, but you're over explaining it as a defense mechanism to, to provide yourself with that solid defense of like, okay, see, I know what I'm talking about here. But it's that over explanation is filling a need for you, but it isn't addressing or filling a need for your team member in that point in time. All they're hearing is like blah, 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 blah. And then what's filtering through is like, you did something wrong. You did something wrong, which leads to a very ineffective conversation. So just to recap those, if you're just jumping on here, those 3 mistakes that I'm talking about are, oh, Carla, thanks for jumping on here. Yes, indeed. So I'm just reading some of the comments here. We teach people how to treat us by what we tolerate. Holding people accountable reinforces the expectation you want to see for them. Do it leveling and still hold them accountable. And yes, be willing to have tough conversations. I fully agree here, Carla. Thank you for contributing and sharing your perspective as well. So just to recap this, here's the 3 things that are the common mistakes that I see. One is you have a lack of clarity as to what your expectations are, a lack of clarity around what accountability and what the outcome needs to be. Two is you're giving a lot of freedom with the expectation that that person knows what they're doing, and you in the results and the lack of, oftentimes it's the lack of action or taking the wrong types of action that you can start to see, well, there's something missing here, and you're avoiding that. And the third one is that you're avoiding those tough conversations. So let's talk about the three strategies in order to get yourself that you are effectively able to hold your team members accountable without diving into the micromanaging. Now, as you might guess, it's the exact opposite of those mistakes. So the first part is really getting clear, but make sure it's clear for yourself as well. Be clear on what is the outcome that you want to see and get as specific as possible. Don't assume anything. And we can keep that, that age old adage of what does assume mean in your mind, but you want to really make it very clear and ask yourself, if I was to give this, for example, if I was to give this to a student in grade 5 or 6, would they understand, without knowing the topic, of course, but would they understand the instructions? Would they be able to inform me what the outcome is that I'm looking for and the result that I want to see? Now, if the answer is no, then you will need to want to go further into what specifically, because all the things that you have on your mind, if you're not actually saying it, then you can't expect your team members to be mind readers. The same is true for you. You can't expect to mind read what your team members are going through or the experience or the questions that they had. They need to address them with you, but you need to start that first by setting that bar of clarity very high for yourself as well as your team, and creating that clarity. It allows a lot better a working relationship, and a lot better give and take, and a lot easier way of holding your team members accountable. One of the things I've always strived for in my leadership roles, and when it came to accountability, but also into that evaluation moments, because we all have those and they're coming up again towards the end of the year, is I always wanted to create results or KPIs. I also wanted always performance metrics that were very objective and not subjective based off of my opinion, but very clear and objective outcomes that both the team member was very clear on what was expected, and that I could be very clear of like, well, you met, it was a yes or no in terms of meeting that metric. So use that for yourself. So get very specific and provide a lot of clarity to your team members when you're wanting to hold them accountable. The second one, when it comes to giving a lot of freedom, of course, it is a little difficult. It's not impossible. It just may not be easy, is to pull them back in when you've given a lot of freedom and they have shown to be unable to deal with that. Now, that coupled with a lot of extra clarity and being very specific in the actions that are needed. So in the example that I gave, where someone, your team, and you're in a sales driven environment, and they are not making the necessary amount of calls to clients, or they're not making the right types of clients, is actually kind of reining in that freedom a little bit by being very clear and saying, okay, these are the amounts of the calls that need to be made. These are the types of clients, and also being very clear as to how do they report this out to you. Again, not allowing that freedom in a sense that they have to, that you're going to do it for them. You're not going to step in there, but you're going to create the boundaries around how you want them and the actions that you want them to take. Now, lastly, the third strategy is around having those tough conversations and letting go of this perception that you're the bad guy if you are not if you're holding your teams accountable, if you're not, one thing that we have to remember is that when it comes to holding team members accountable, make sure that you're tough on the professional side, so the business side of it, the result side of it, and soft on the relationship. So what does that mean? So if you have done the first couple of like making sure you've given them additional clarity when it comes to the freedom, right? Like you've given them too much freedom, so now you're going to narrow it down, be more specific, allow them some autonomy where they can create their own outcomes, or that they can contribute with their own ideas. And then it comes to that difficult conversation. Again, when you have that clarity built in, when you have specific guardrails or boundaries in which they have to act on, then holding them accountable and having those tough conversations becomes a lot easier, because it can be much more directed and specific in terms of where are things that you're not seeing. If you have lack of clarity, if you have a lot of freedom and it's not working, and then you also avoid those tough conversations, you're creating almost a perfect storm for yourself to have a completely unmanageable team, one that will not listen or respect you, and one that does not deliver the results and actually is like almost like an anchor holding both the team as well as yourself down. And remember, if you've got multiple team members on your team and some of them are really well, performing really well and others aren't, and you're avoiding the tough conversations on how on holding a team member accountable, everyone else in that team sees that as well, which is going to affect not only the performance of the one team member that isn't performing up to what your expectations are, but also for the rest of the team members. Because, hey, you know what? If they're getting away with it or they're not having to perform, and you're wanting to avoid the conversation because you don't want to be, for whatever reason, because they may not know why, then it's going to affect the entire team cohesion as well. So for yourself, as an effective, wanting to become an effective leader, and also when you're looking to make that step to go from more operational, where you're really into the day-to-day stuff, because that's often what happens is you find yourself doing the day-to-day work because you're taking it away from your team, right? You're micromanaging either by sitting on top of them and asking them everything, or doing it yourself. Or the opposite of that is really moving into with clear expectations, communicating it very clearly, and giving them very structured boundaries and ways of functioning, as well as having those tough conversations. Well, then you can elevate both your team into a more of a high performing team, but also yourself into a much more of a strategic role. So when you are ready to stop ending up you're ready to transition, let's put it that way. So transform from that task manager, that operational, like you're in the operation every single day and you're trying to figure out, how do I make this different? But you want to go to, and you want to move towards that strategic leader role. In the next 60 to 90 days, I'm looking for 5 women in leadership who are ready to make that shift. So if that is you, then DM me ease so that you can find out more. Let's just recap for today. So for today, what I share is how to hold your team accountable without micromanaging. Now, here are some common mistakes, I should say, that I see women making when they're in their leadership and holding their teams accountable. One, they lack clarity on what the deliverables and the outcomes are, and they lack clarity on what accountability actually is. Number two, they have provided a lot of freedom to their teams or to their team members. And that has proven that that team member has not been able to thrive or be able to be successful in that amount of freedom. And they are not taking, there's a lack of actions that let's phrase this in the right way. They are not taking all of the actions that are needed, or they're taking the wrong actions because they have too much freedom in that sense. And three, the third mistake that I often see is you're avoiding the tough conversations and having those tough, really those well, that's what it is. Tough conversations, having those courageous conversations with your team members or your team member on their performance, the outcomes, and then really creating that clarity for them. And how do you fix it? Those are three different ways. Again, first strategy is create a massive amount of clarity and specificity around the results that you want to see, the actions that you want to be taking, and also when you expect it by. Number two, when it comes to the freedom, you are creating boundaries, you're creating a scope of the environment in which they need to operate. And again, being very clear and being very specific without having to justify everything on your end. And the third tactic is really stepping into those courageous conversations, having those tough conversations. And when you've got the clarity as well as the scope very clear and set out, that makes that tough conversation a lot easier, because now you can have the conversation on the professional level without having to, butt heads on the personal level. Because if you've done this correctly, when you've done this correctly, then the personal relationship can remain, and you can still not dive into that micromanagement, but you have allowed the responsibility to still rest with your team member because you created the clarity, the scope, and now you're having that tough conversation on the expectations that you have of them, and you're holding them accountable. All right. So that is a quick summary, although that was still a longer summary, but a quick summary of what we talked about today. If you've got any questions, as always, drop into my DMs. Love to see you there. And as I said, there are, I'm looking for 3 to 5 women. I think you said 5 on there, but 3 to 5 women who are ready to transform from being a task manager, stuck in the day-to-day operational, and up level into more of a strategic leadership role within their current role, or even into a next level role in the next 60 to 90 days. And if that is you, then DM me ease, and we will have a conversation to find out more. So thank you very much for watching. As always, drop your comments below. Would love to hear if you've got any questions or thoughts. And as always, my DMs are also open for any questions and comments there as well. Thank you so much for listening.